Hello Year 9 and welcome to the first lesson of this half term on your new unit, Development Dynamics. As you can see on the board, this is the first part of the specification displayed, and we're going to be investigating the question, what is the scale of global inequality and how can it be reduced? This lesson, you can see that there are certain tasks that you will need to complete, but then there are specific tasks that we would like you to submit to your class teacher at the end of the lesson. So make sure you've got a pen and a paper and you can make notes. And as we go through, pause and restart the video as and when you wish. So today's title is Defining and Measuring Development. So as a starter, I would like you to look at these two pictures. So in this picture, there are two little girls in what looks initially a very similar situation. But if you look a little bit closer, you can see that these two girls are actually in very different situations. What I'd like you to try and do is I'd like you to try and really look at these pictures and think about how these girls are connected. I'd like you to also think about how the two girls in the picture are separated, and also I'd like you to try and write a definition for development in your own words. So you can stop now, and you can stop the video now, pause it, and start thinking about the differences between these two pictures and anything that links them. So the next part of the lesson, we're going to be looking at this map of the world. Now you can see that the map of the world has been divided, and it's been divided by a line that runs through not the centre of the earth. It doesn't go through the equator, but it does separate countries in the northern hemisphere to countries in the southern hemisphere. So those countries that are displayed in blue, we will start to realise, and you will start to realise, that these are our developed nations. So these countries have greater wealth. People in these countries will probably have a better quality of life. They'll probably have access to better education and healthcare as well. And it is the countries underneath this line, which is known as the Brandt line, that are considered developing or emerging countries. And these are the terms that we're going to be using in this unit. Developed for the richest nations in the world, emerging for those countries that are no longer developing but are not quite yet at the standard of living of maybe some of those countries in Europe, and then finally developing countries, which would be countries such as those that we would find in Africa, on the continent of Africa. So with this is the next task we would like you to complete, but as mentioned before, these tasks are for you to complete in order to cement your understanding of the unit, but they are not needed to, you do not need to submit them to your class teacher. So the first question is, why is Australia the anomaly under the Brandt line theory? So an anomaly is an odd one out. So if you look at where Australia is on the map, and you look at all of the other countries that are above the line or in blue, why would we suggest that Australia is the odd one out? So think about the hemispheres, the northern and the southern hemispheres, and think about what makes Australia slightly different to the rest. The second question I would like you to think about is about South Africa. So it says South Africa has a relatively strong economy and is a wealthier country in the continent of Africa. Why do you think this is currently part of the poor South? So again, I'd like you to think about what might make South Africa, what is it about South Africa that perhaps still makes it, still categorises it as underneath the Brandt line and perhaps a developing or an emerging country. And then finally, this map obviously shows China in red. I'd like you to start thinking about whether or not you agree. Should China still be in red? And if you think it shouldn't, why is that? If you believe China should still be considered one of the poorer countries in the world, then I'd also like you to explain that answer too. Okay, so the next task is very straightforward. There are 3 ways in which we can define development. So all I'd like you to do is read these 3 definitions and match them up to the correct key word. So we can measure or define development in terms of the social development, economic development, or political development of a country. So what I would like you to try and remind yourself is when we're talking about social impacts or social causes or social factors, what is it that we're talking about? Usually we're talking about things that impact people. So I'd like you to try and think, okay, well, which definition on this slide is defining social development, is linked to the development of people, the quality of life of people. Then economic development is going to be largely to do with how much money a country has and how that money is generated. So we generate money through jobs. So you need to be thinking about anything to do with the amount of money a country has, but also the jobs that the people in that country do. And that would give you an indication of what economic development is. And then finally, political development is really looking at equality between different groups of people, whether or not we have a democracy where people have the right to vote, whether there is freedom of speech within a country, because these things suggest that a country is more developed. So please pause the video now and write out your 3 definitions, making sure you've matched them up correctly. And then this is something you would have done possibly in year 8. I would like you to start thinking about questions you would ask, or we could ask, that would help us understand the level of development of a country. So, for example, do people get enough to eat? The answer to that question would help us to ascertain whether or not a country is developed or not. If people are getting enough to eat in a country, we can assume that probably that country is more developed. And then we've got these other ones that come around the PowerPoint here. So it says, does everyone have access to clean water? How wealthy are people on average? How long are people expected to live? Do people have access to medical help if they are ill? Can everyone read and write? What are the chances of children dying before they reach the age of 5? And is everybody treated equally? If you were to ask these questions about different countries, you would be able to have an understanding of whether or not those countries are developing, emerging, or developed countries. So you probably can remember that when we're talking about how long people are expected to live, this is a development indicator that we would call life expectancy. We also would look at literacy rate, which is how many people within a population can read and write. That tells us about the level of development of a country, because if lots of people can read and write, the likelihood is lots of people have access to a good free education. So what I'd like you to do is just have a little look at these questions again and try and think about which indicator of development they're referring to. So the first task you're going to complete today and make sure you submit to your teacher is this one. And on the next slide, you're able to complete this. So what I'd like you to do is read all of the statements and decide which development indicator they are describing. And to do this, you need to use all of the options in the yellow box. So once you've done that, you can then also colour code these in terms of any social development indicators, so ones that are about people, and any economic development indicators, which are any that are about jobs or the wealth of a country. So to give you an example, if we look at primary employment, what you can do is you can either print this slide off or you can write it on the PowerPoint yourself. But we're looking at the definition of primary employment, and we can see it here. Primary employment is the percentage of people in the country employed by primary occupations. A primary job would be something like agriculture. And if lots of people in a country are employed in agriculture, that suggests that that country is probably a developing country. As a country starts to develop, fewer people work in farming and more people work in the service industry or even manufacturing. The next one that I'll help you with would be birth rate. So birth rate, we can see here is the number of births per year per 1,000 people. So again, if you have a lot of babies being born, this actually suggests that that country is also a developing country, one of the poorer countries in the world. And this is for many reasons. It might be because there is a lack of contraception or family planning. It might be that families have lots of children because so many children will actually die. It's also another reason some families in the developing world will have lots of babies is so they can help work the land and make money for that family. When we're thinking about whether these are social or economic, birth rates is referring to people and the way that people live their lives. So it would be a social factor that you could colour code red. And the previous slide showed primary employment, which is about jobs and the way people make money, which would mean that it is an economic development indicator because it's to do with obviously the way in which people generate money in the country. So task 4, again, this is just something I'd like you to look at, I'd like you to study, and I'd like you to consider these questions. So here are a list of countries, developing, developed and emerging countries, and it shows some of the development indicators that you will have just identified in the previous task. What is interesting when you look at these is how varied the GDP per capita is, so that is the wealth per person if it's divided out equally by the population. Also, the birth rate varies dramatically between the developing world, where you have Papua New Guinea and Niger, which have very high birth rates, as opposed to Japan and the UK, which have very low birth rates, only 8 and 12 babies being born for every 1,000 people. Also, the death rate, you can see death rates are also quite varied, but a little bit less so. Infant mortality rate is extremely different. So we have this means the number of children dying before they reach the age of 5. So have a little look through the different facts and figures, and finally the literacy rate. And what you can see is that these countries are really defined and measured. Their development is measured using these development indicators. And then again, as always with geography, we're always trying to look for something that doesn't quite fit the pattern. So are there any bits of data here that you don't think fits, that you think maybe don't fit the pattern? And why do you think that is? Are there any countries that have actually a very low birth rate or a high birth rate? So for example, the UK and Japan have quite high death rates, for example, and that might be because we actually now have aging populations. So we have more elderly people in our population, which then increases the death rate. So have a think about those. And then we move on to your final task of the lesson that you have to then submit. So remember, you're submitting task 3 and also task 5. So on the PowerPoint, you can change the colour of these. You can also write on them. So this is identifying levels of development. So I'd like you to read each of the statements and decide whether they are referring to developed or developing countries. Use the key and colour code the developed and developing countries. So for example, a significant amount of trade. If a country is trading a lot, that would suggest it's probably a developed country. High infant mortality, so lots of children being born, would suggest it's probably a developing country, maybe because healthcare is poor and therefore children get poorly and they unfortunately don't get better. Then a limited trade opportunities would be referring to developing countries, and therefore the opposite, low infant mortality, would be developed. So what I'd now like you to do is go through and colour code all of these. If you can't colour code them, you can just write developed or developing underneath each of them. And your final task is to watch this video. This is linked in this YouTube comment section, but also you can click on this video and it will take you straight to it if you're in the PowerPoint. So I'd like you to watch this video, which shows the difference between life expectancy and GDP, and it gives you a bit of an understanding of how countries develop. So just to recap what you need to submit today, I would like you to make sure in the green box here you have submitted the 2 worksheets, task 3 and task 5. So what you'll need to do is you can either print these off or you can complete them on the PowerPoint itself and submit that to your class teacher. Alternatively, you can write them out yourself by hand. That's absolutely fine too, and you can upload a photograph of that. All of the other tasks, the starter, task 1, task 2 and task 4, I would like you to complete, but as mentioned, these are not required in the submission of your work. I hope that has all made sense, and I hope that has helped you have a good understanding of this new unit on development and the differences in levels of development around the world. We will have another lesson again next week.